Hello. So Gage and I, Gage is, we are both Masters of Social Work students, and Gage is on the board of directors of Fountain of Comfort, and I am the executive director of Fountain of Comfort. And Fountain of Comfort is a resource for mental health. It's a public resource for mental health and an attempt to um, be scientific and non-ideological and trustworthy in a situation where a lot of us feel like um, we can't really trust a lot of the institutions out there. Um, and Part of that, I mean, is the mental health crisis and the discussions we've all been having about the what appears to be a very clear mental health crisis, um, and that includes what appears to be a kind of an epidemic of um, you can call it gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. Um, but really, I mean, the real number, I think, you can't deny is the amount of people, little kids that are being hospitalized for self harm and who commit suicide. And what came out last Wednesday was the CAS review, in which it is from the United Kingdom. There's a link in the description. And there has been a lot of discussion about it in the UK, not much discussion about it in the United States. And I think there are reasons for that. Um, and this is a difficult thing to talk about, but I think it's important. And Gage thinks it's important. And we want to speak about it responsibly, but we do want to speak about it because it is important. And frankly, I mean, I was considering starting off with a salvo that alienates everybody, and maybe that's what we should do. Especially, um, some people are dismissing the cast report as transphobic, which there hasn't been a lot of that, but it's that dog just doesn't seem to be hunting at all because it obviously just does not apply. At the same time, I think some people, and frankly, I think Dr. Jordan Peterson might even be falling into that, is have been kind of triumphalist in a way that um, gives the impression to some people that suddenly there's going to be this idea that, oh, there's no such thing as a trans kid, so though any child that may be experiencing what could be termed gender dysphoria could not, should not, would not be receiving even therapy or anything like that, or um, people who are um, want to see an end to all um, anyone ever being transgender, which is remarkably historically, like, if you know anything about the history of the world, like there are there are currently 500,000 hijra in India. Um, if you don't know what hijra are, maybe you need to stop talking um, about gender and transgender stuff. And if you think that all 500,000 of those people who pretty much all of them have had bottom surgery, meaning they've they've had at least their testicles removed. you're just not paying attention, and I think part of the problem is a lot of people are not paying attention, and so I don't know. I guess that's all of the hemming and hawing that I wanted to do before we start. Was there hemming and hawing you wanted to do before we start?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the cultural context from which a conversation like that the cast report in some sense could instigate, regardless of who's talking and what they're talking about, there'll be this like veneer about over the top about caring for the children. But if you look closely along the lines of the rhetoric, usually in my experience, a lot of times on both sides, the children are just being used like in the way that you see it with like gun control. And it's like, don't you care about the children? Like, like on either side. And I find that weak. I find that perpetuating the problem. Um,
And hurting children.
right, right. Um, and so I, I think in some sense, making that the focus, at least of this conversation, is definitely what I want to do, because I think if the cast report does do something good and can be taken up in a good way, it's for that purpose, rather than kind of letting it just blow over in some grand cultural narrative type of a problem, and not actually inform anything on the ground, which is oftentimes what happens. It like changes things in the culture war, but then kind of status quo happens in terms of what's going on in the nitty gritty aspects of the mental health field. Um, and
I don't know how much you've been following what's going on in the UK though, because
well, I have seen the puberty blockers has come to an end as far
and
as
social transition.
and social transitioning. But I have a lot of questions about that. In
Yeah,
terms of,
that was the most surprising thing to come out of it.
yeah, right. What is that? What are they saying about that exactly?
I wish. I mean, the report is over 300 pages. I have not.
Yeah.
I have not read it, and even when you read it yourself and you haven't gotten like the analysis from other people, it's hard to really know what's going on. What I found was a lot of what I did see was just stating things that should be obvious and everybody should agree to, but are somehow like political hot potatoes. I actually so the this one page of charts. Let me pull this page up. I should have probably like chosen some, but there was one page of charts in which I mean the chart was just so obviously like Daesh at the beginning that it's like I can't believe you need to say this in a 300-page report. Why can't you cut this report down without
Mm.
like making these graphs? Um, at the same time, it was like, well, funny enough, this was one of the things that the people who are trying to hear it is. So the people who are trying, like, this may be the most controversial among the political people. This is on page 99. Let me see if this is big enough. Are you guys? Let's see if I can make this easier for people to see. Um, so, um, like,
That's good.
yeah, this is a chart showing male and female. Right, female is in orange, male is in green. Right, and basically the distribution. So height, right? So the distribution is number of people, and the the x-axis is height. And obviously, I mean, it should go without saying that females tend to be shorter than males, right?
Right.
Why you would need to say this, right? Is itself amazing, right? Um, the least overlap is by identification with male gender, right? It's like very few females by sex um, identify as male, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I mean, I think that I actually think the flatness of the curve, they did not bother. That they've made equally flat curves, which may partially be an attempt to keep people from losing their mind, because the curves, male curves tend to be flatter than female curves, but let's not
Right.
go
Right.
there necessarily. Um, Interest in male sexual partners, right? So this is sexual orientation, right? Gender role behavior. Now, this isn't how you identify, but whether you are gender conforming in terms of do you um, do you play with dolls or do you play with trucks, right?
What's the x-axis there in terms of what is it measuring?
Um, the x-axis is um, conformance to gender behavior, gender role behavior.
Gotcha.
Okay. I think all of these visualizations are just visualizations of facts we know to be true without these are not statistical models,
I see. Okay.
right? Especially, I mean, if it was a statistical model, there's no way the shapes of the curves would be the
Right.
exact
Right. Right.
same,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Right.
Um, it, so one of the gender role behaviors is interest in toys. Okay, interest in boys' toys. Boys tend to be more interested in boys' toys. Girls tend to be more interested in girls' toys, but they obviously overlap greatly,
Right.
right? Um, like, um, yeah. So, um,
Well, what I think in some sense this
yeah.
um what I think this and you've seen this kind of become a thing in a lot of conversations is this kind of impetus to now try and impose like this like statistical way of thinking about obvious things, kind of to your point about how in some sense it's like I don't know how like helpful that is on the part of the cast report to even post something like that. It's almost admitting that these like a lot of the arguments going on about this have to do with like the validity of scientific and statistical models, and a lot of the conversations get bogged down at that level, and this is like kind of playing into that, but also obviously not at the same time because it's not an actual, like you just said, it's not.
Well, it has to speak in, and this was part of the thing, right? I was reading, from what I was reading, it was very clear that they are trying, like, okay, so let's talk about Hillary Cass, the person who led this report. So she was a pediatrician who became famous for being a whistleblower. She was president of, I guess they call it the College of Pediatrics. It's whatever the
Yeah, right.
pediatric association is
It's
in.
called pediatrics. Yep.
Okay, and she was a retired pediatrician. And when they decided to undergo this review 4 years ago, they appointed her as someone who was a recognized, um, respected outsider, completely from the outside, to come in and conduct this review. And I've heard interviews with her in which she said she thought it would be 6 months of coming out of retirement and just basically rubber stamping everything that was already going on. As most doctors, and this is the thing, when you talk to people who are doctors, oftentimes, or people who are just very invested in the institutions that most of us trust, they just assume that business has been as usual in this in the practice of medicine here. And so 2 years into the review, she put out a preliminary statement, not a final report, but a preliminary statement, which caused a lot of changes, immediate changes in the national health system. And this is her final review, and it's triggering. So it's going to trigger a review of adult services. So this is part of what's been most controversial, is she had the adult services. So there was the children's gender services, and then there was the adult services. The adult services clinics refused to cooperate with her review. And the fact is, she's from everything I have seen, the establishment in the United Kingdom is being very supportive of her and implementing all of her recommendations, including so I mean, their two parties are the Conservatives and Labour, right? The two major parties. And Labour has, in fact, kind of unqualified endorsement of this review.
Right.
Whereas it seems, if anything, from Conservatives, and I mean, Mary Harrington wrote a piece on Unheard, where and basically I think Jordan Peterson is on the same line, where they're like, okay, where are the guillotines, basically. And to some extent, I have to agree. The Guardian, which if you don't know UK politics, the Guardian is basically on the left.
Yeah, right.
The Guardian, in their interview with Dr. Cass, asked her if there should be discipline of any of the doctors who were involved in some of this behavior, and she said it's not her remit to talk about disciplining the doctors.
Which is the right answer, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, that puts her in a bind, and she can't answer that question in a way that isn't going to come back to hurt.
I guess, but you know what? As a member of a profession, right? I want to see people in my profession held up to professional standards, and what she has clearly found is that professional standards were not being maintained and are not being maintained.
So she can at least speak to that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, she's trying to be very politic. She's trying to be very, she's certainly not and I mean, this is a very British thing. Um, what has been fascinating for me is to see how things are operating in Great Britain in ways that I don't think they can in the United States.
Right, right. Partly just due to the centralization of the health system is a huge reason for that. And not to mention their politics are just not nearly as polarizing. Um,
That's
there's
the weird thing. Their politics. I mean, until 20 years ago, you would always say that United States politics is less polarized than
right,
European politics.
of course, right.
I,
I think that's partly because well, first of all, there's been a lot of restructuring going on. I mean, UK politics have been very all over the place, and just even in the last 5 years.
yeah.
But I think also part of it is Americans will oftentimes see their Americans will oftentimes see their kind of stance in terms of more associated with a party
Mhm.
than I think is the case in the UK. The parties don't have, now they do at the actual political level, but I mean in terms of people's involvement. Um, like my actually my dad's from England, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he moved over here when he was 25. So all of his family, my grandmother, um, aunts and uncles live over there. And um, party identification is just not nearly as important to the average UK citizen. Um, and the likelihood that UK citizens change parties and change who they vote for is a lot more frequent than the case in the United States, where there's more entrenchment.
That is really surprising to me, and I'm wondering if that's new because from what I understood, it was the opposite.
I know this. I mean, a lot of this is just in terms of
What your
conversations I've
family
had with
says.
my family, right? So these aren't macro statistics. These are more in terms of my family and what they've told me about the political scene. So they're not very political. So that also may may affect it somewhat. But I think kind of going back to I don't know if you saw the part where it was talking about neurodivergent the neurodivergent children,
Mhm.
and how I think like special exception was made where neurodivergent children, I forgot, I don't even remember the exact wording, but are have stronger restrictions on their freedoms in order to be able to you know transition. And I'm interested to hear what you think about this, because there's an aspect of which I don't like about that, in terms of, first of all, it to some extent kind of infantilizes.
The neurodivergent.
Yeah, right. And I also think that neurodivergent children are more likely to be non-gender conforming, and this is a complicated topic, but
Well,
there's a strong connection between neurodivergency and gender non-conforming. Um,
especially in girls.
correct, right, right. And so I don't know in some sense how helpful that is. I get it in the sense that it's further protections for a more vulnerable population. But I also think this is where kind of whole other side of the conversation that you kind of opened with wraps around with. This inevitably opens up a conversation around having to actually have a sophisticated way of talking about what a gender non-conforming person is, and where their place is, and what this means, rather than what I see a lot of people in the kind of conservative sphere kind of being very dismissive of that topic. And I actually think it's making the problem a lot
Yes.
worse. So we didn't need to jump right into that, but it just came up to me when I was thinking about the neurodivergent.
No, I mean that is definitely an incredibly important part of it. Um, just, I mean, so part of gender ideology and where gender ideology, and some people will find even talking about gender ideology as being um, so on Twitter, I encountered someone who transitioned as a child, is an adult now, and she transitioned as a teenager 30, 40 years ago, something like that, and lives as a female, married to a man, and has two uh, children, I assume adopted. Um, and I was reading her website, which was actually, and I asked her would come on the channel, but I did ask her to come on the channel. And she seemed like a very reasonable person. It actually, ContraPoints, I don't know how much you've listened to ContraPoints, Natalie Wynn. Um, again, what seems to be a very reasonable person with very different facts than what I see, right? Like, I think if we agreed on the facts, we would agree, like, basically 100%.
Mm.
But the world they see is very different from the world I see. And one thing Natalie Wynn, ContraPoints, has said multiple times, and one thing this woman who's also kind of, a speaker in this space has said multiple times, I saw on her website, is there's nobody who's kind of rushing kids to transition, right? And that's a question of fact, right? Is there anybody who is emotionally invested in children transitioning? And the fact is, there are people who are obviously ideologically possessed by this idea of gender queering and deconstructing gender, etc., who are very, very excited. And that's why, like, this very niche, small, I mean, it's in the DSM. It's one of it isn't it, like, gender dysphoria is a thing. It's an actual thing, and it's been a thing, and it deserves to be a thing. It needs to be a thing, right? But it's gaining all this political attention because people are using it as a political football, and that's what the Cass report says. And I really want to hear Natalie Wynn or this other person I encountered on Twitter, like, actually address the facts, right? Which is, I mean, it has become increasingly clear, and in many countries they've stopped prescribing puberty blockers at all.
Right.
And I think it was obvious to anyone and everyone that the idea that puberty blockers are completely reversible and without any downsides whatsoever, which you heard. I mean, I certainly heard that from people. I'm sure you did as well.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
that they're completely safe and reversible was obviously, like, impossible. It's not possible to make huge hormonal changes in little children and say that it's completely reversible. It's just not true. That's
Right.
not.
Well,
how biology works.
In a lot of these come from like this, like when your position is in some sense at threat of being argued on kind of more foundational grounds, then you in some sense begin to overcompensate for your position. And you see this a lot. I mean, the very fact that there are many people on this in the conversation that literally will say detransitioning never actually happens. The only time people detransition are simply because of the pressures on society. They couldn't make it in some sense because of the oppression is so bad, and so they
That
kind of
person is actually trans, but they're
right, correct,
transitioning because of internalized
right.
transphobia.
Right. And I'm also not saying the opposite thing that see because there's detransitioners that means do you see what I'm saying? It's like there's there's like this tendency to and this goes back to your point about the
It's the
facts.
cognitive distortion of black and white thinking.
Right. Right. And again, it's harming everybody because what you do with that is then now you have this whole growing population of detransitioners that feel alienated from either community, and now there's the detransitioning mental health issues that now no one seems interested in picking up because they're discarded by both sides in some sense. Now they may now the conservative side of might like want to use them to like see and like pull them up and lift see, and that's not helpful to them at all. That's horrible. And that temptation is part of it. I remember, you seeing this conversation change with conversations around abortion over time, where all of a sudden it's now a good thing to have an abortion is like now like in some sense like that excitement about it, in some sense which just never was a part of the conversation, and first of all invalidates the experience of all of the trauma related, whether you have an abortion or not, given the situation where you're considering one, completely devalues it and treats it like it's just some choice, or it's basically, I'm making this choice to make a political statement. And I see that happening with this issue. And it's not clear to me from the Cass report. I see certain elements of it playing into that and certain elements of it not, and actually being really helpful. And that's what makes this so complicated. It's very much not clear either way.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems from what I've seen, and I to some extent, I feel like it reduces how helpful the report is to be trying to be all things to all people.
Right.
I mean, does a doctor really need to say? And the funny thing is, like some of the gender ideologues have started to criticize it on cis normativity, right? And it's like, okay, that's a dog that's not going to hunt, right? Cis normativity, like, yeah, our society is cis normative, meaning that we believe that normal is most people, vast majority of people, everyone except the exceptions are cisgendered.
Right.
That's
in
not
order
controversial.
in order to even think, you have to have a normative pattern and an exceptional pattern. You can't just have random patterns. You can't even categorize the world that way. And so even if you buy into the whole thing that like, well, we shouldn't have it is normative and it's normative now, and that is not oppressive to think that way. Normative, first of all, you can think of normative just as majority, even though that's not exactly what normative is, but still, even the fact that as long as there's a majority of something, I mean, you see this with all issues that are around these conversations, like white normativity and stuff like that. And all of the normativity arguments in some sense stem from this idea that there should be no hierarchy of value. And again, this goes back to the whole conversation around hierarchy of value. Even when hierarchies have absolutely nothing to do with power and control, but are actually about just fundamental categories you need in order to look at the world. And so, like, that deconstructive game goes to something that becomes such a performative contradiction so quickly that it's almost astounding.
Well, part of the problem is people will not believe me when I say that there are people who will say that cis normativity or heteronormativity. Frankly, like I've become a proponent of heteronormativity simply by saying, yes, guess what? If we did not have any heterosexual couples, society would end. Like, we would last one more generation without any heterosexual couples.
Right.
So let's. I mean, if you want to call that oppressive and like, what are you even trying to say to me, right? And
well,
yeah,
this kind of stems into it. I mean, this isn't maybe where we should go with this, but this stems into a whole larger conversation around how this whole issue is, in my opinion, covertly related to all sorts of reproduction technologies that are going to be where that I've always felt like that's where this is headed, and that this groundwork has to be laid. And I'm not saying that the majority of the people who are involved in this think that. I'm more speaking kind of at a higher level. But and that's more speaking in terms of that's the spiritual direction and where it's headed. And I mean, the amount of people. I mean, like my wife and I are thinking about having children and everything like that, and like we know
do it.
We're trying.
Try harder.
Yeah, right. That always works. No.
Have sex more.
Yeah, right. No, but basically, like a huge part of what we're noticing of just a lot of our non-religious friends and stuff like that. There's all these weird things going on where like this, like my wife's friend, one of like her not super close friends, but is basically, it's a lesbian couple and they're getting a sperm donation from the partner's brother.
Okay.
And the partner's brother is like now involved in the relationship, and there's all of these weird kind of ways of which you're circumventing because this whole thing that you were talking about in terms of okay, the population ends in a generation if it's not normative. I think the goal in some sense is to create human beings outside of the context of a traditional family. And to do that, this type of a cultural ground shaking change is necessary so that individuals are not being raised within the dichotomy of a mother and a father in a extended family context with the particular idiosyncrasies that come with your inherent racial and all these types of things, and then how that branches out. I know this is getting away from the topic a little bit, but I do feel like
it is and it isn't. I mean, when was the last time you read Crime and Punishment?
5 years ago, maybe.
I reread it recently, and I was really surprised that there's a character in there who talks about like, yeah, getting rid of the family, and because that was like the Marxist.
It's in the Communist Manifesto actually pretty explicitly. I didn't realize that actually.
Yeah. So I mean, this idea does exist, and I think there are some people who intentionally espouse it. I do think there's actually a lot more people who are just they're confused. They don't
Yeah.
have that. Um, they don't. They simply don't have a narrative framework within which to understand their meaning and their life, and you know. Um, so Camille Paglia, she teaches art history, and she said recently one of her classes she played the spiritual Go Down Moses.
Okay.
She was trying to have a discussion with her class about this song, Go Down Moses.
Right.
And she said it was just so hard to get anybody to actually talk about it until she realized her students didn't know who Moses was.
Yeah.
I mean, what, and this really does go into like, do little children still play house? Like, you'll be the mommy, I'll be the daddy, right? Um, and, you know, because over the past 30, 40 years, and I've seen it, I mean, with people that I'm close with, they're trying to raise their children without gender roles, without stereotypes. And it's like, okay, what are you giving your kids in terms of instruction on how they will live and how they can live and how they can relate to others and be a man or be a woman?
You have to become something. Right. So when you give someone just a blank template, it doesn't help them.
Right. And so it's not even, it doesn't seem to me even that much that, yeah, there are people who are trying to deconstruct sex and gender and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a lot of it is just confusion.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and that's very connected to the whole thing of nobody knowing Moses. Is in some sense it's not it's at first when you first brought that up I didn't know if people were going to have a problem with Moses or that was what it was. But it's not even that. It's just who's Moses.
Who's
It's like
Moses?
right like it's basic things about not that basic patterns we've known about reality forever that aren't givens anymore for a huge majority of the population. And those are the ones that, in some sense, don't have the roots. Those are the ones falling into the meaning crisis most severely. Those are the ones most involved in gender dysphoria and everything like that because they don't have any roots at all.
Yeah. Max, so Max is actually a clinical social worker. And I'm going to I'm going to DM him a link. If you would like to jump on, Max, we would love to discuss this with you. But, or anybody else who actually wants to jump on, like, go ahead and DM me. I'm not going to do a free for all, but like, um, David says, from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. To be honest, I was actually thinking of Acts 15, which says in all the synagogues, Moses is preached every week.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, well, it all started going off the way when they stopped preaching Moses every week in the churches. It's only been 2,000 years.
Right, that's it. That's why none of Paglia's students know anything about Moses.
I'm telling you, if you guys kept to, if the Christian churches still kept to Acts 15, I want an Acts 15 church that reads from Moses every week. Then we'll talk. Like
Oh boy.
everybody has these Acts 2 churches, Acts 17 churches.
Yeah, right, right. You're
Acts
like, no, no,
15,
no, no. Act 15 church is where it's
yeah,
at. Yeah.
give me an Acts 15 church, then we'll talk. Uh, uh, I guess we could get into Viktor Frankl, but back to thank you very much, Bazani. Don't please don't forget to like and subscribe. And I have to say, please don't forget to donate to Fountain of Comfort because what we would like is it. I would like Fountain of Comfort to actually be helping people in ways that aren't politicized.
Mhm.
And I was just talking to somebody yesterday whose father runs a Christian school for troubled teenage girls, and he said all of them are non-binary, and this was not on the coasts, right? Um, and I mean, you deal with in your internship, you're dealing with people who are you at a gender clinic or
No, but in the city that I'm in Hartford, it's it's a private practice that markets itself specifically um, to transgender. I mean, there's certain reasons for that, but
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I co-lead a trans men, trans women, and a trans youth group, um, and also a significant portion of my caseload are transgender because that's what the clinic works with. Um, but it's not in some sense explicitly that. Um,
Mm.
but I, I mean, in terms of like the, I mean, I did see something that said something like somewhere between 18 to 23% of Gen Z um, identify as being non-binary.
Well,
Uh,
there was actually I saw some charts here in the cast review,
of
which
that.
which talked about specifically yeah, percentage, and they had US adults because that's where they had the statistics for.
Mhm.
um so this is figure 21. Percentage of US adults identifying as transgender by sex assigned at birth and generation 2021 2022. And this is percentages on the y axis. So with Gen Z, female transgender is 3%. Percentage of US adults identifying as non binary by sex assigned at birth and gender. Gen Z, female is 4%, male is 2.5%, so that's 6.5%. 6.5, let's call that 1.5, so that's 8 plus 3. You're looking at 11% who are not cisgender
Right. Right.
of Gen Z. You're looking at, yeah, if I did that correctly.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's
Unless that it depends how they did male and female. Unless you have to average the two to get the general population. I don't know if you can add if you have to average the two in order to get. You're looking at something closer to 6%.
yeah. I'm not sure how it was done. I
Yeah.
mean, for me, one of the most frustrating things for me is this kind of reverse way of looking at the situation where, you know, I mean, you mentioned that that person you were talking to who they work with, you said just troubled just troubled youth in general, or was it troubled youth?
Yeah.
So and that you said like all of them are non-binary. Now,
Well, that's what they. I mean, this was a casual conversation. I was.
no, yeah, right. I'm not like trying to talk about the specifics. I'm just saying like I will often hear that they're troubled because they're not being accepted by the society. And that if the society acceptance could change, this is the prevailing narrative in a lot of these spheres. And I think this is really important to bring up because I actually think that this thinking is doing more harm than the actual phenomena as such. And part of that is because you see this actually in the way in which the DSM changed once it got its fifth edition, where under gender dysphoria, it's now gender affirming care is gender dysphoria is only in reference to societal perceptions
Right.
of them. And what that does is it puts you in a bind. If you're to try and follow clinically the DSM, it actually puts you in a bind. If you give that diagnosis, you in some sense can be accused of not following the DSM
Well, yeah.
if you in some sense don't prescribe to that underlying assumption about the diagnosis as such.
So the Advocate wrote an article on the CAS review in which they pointed to an American Psychological Association um, declaration, and they said that the APA has debunked the idea that being trans could be a result of depression, anxiety, or trauma, or being neurodivergent. And it's like, no, the APA never actually said that, but that's what you're saying they said, right? And like, this is such an obviously stupid way of framing the entire question. There are people who will come to a therapist because and say that they are trans, but are in some manner otherwise have a problem.
Yeah.
Clearly, they may have Munchausen. Not even Munchausen by proxy. They may have Munchausen syndrome, right? There are human beings who have Munchausen syndrome. And a doctor should not do surgery on someone until they are sure that this person does not have Munchausen syndrome, which is an actual thing. Well, actually, I mean, I forget what the actual name of Munchausen is nowadays.
No, yeah.
Histrionic personality, I think it falls under. I forget. But these are like, when people talk about gatekeeping, right? Yes, I want surgeons gatekeeping surgery. Just because you want surgery doesn't mean that the surgeon should do surgery. This should be obvious.
Well, and I don't know if I ever talked to you about. Sorry.
Hi, David.
Hi, Jacob. Hi, Gage. Where I kind of entered some of these, or had to think about it a lot more, is about 15 years ago, I was volunteering with the homeless in downtown Toronto. Okay. And so that was before there was this boom of gender transitions. But if you were heavily involved in the homeless, and the church/shelter you were volunteering with was a street over from where the gay community was, you knew a lot more about it a lot earlier on, right? And it's so preposterous to me, and the social work influence was so ridiculous, because we had someone come in once, and he was schizophrenic, he was off his meds, and one week he came in with his face painted blue, and he started wailing out loud and said that he was a Native American, and that's why he was doing it. Okay? Because of the involvement with the homeless, we had a lot of Native Americans. So he thought that was normal. So, but next week he comes in a dress and says his name is Sally. And the people with the social work backgrounds said we have to support him. We have to support them now that we know they're trans. Right. And the notion that this person was not having issues of identity, like without a doubt, you have to take those things seriously when people have that level of issue with their identity. I should have stated he was a white guy, by the way, when he painted his face blue. But there was a way in which people were not taking the issues seriously by merely saying, aha, we have this, therefore it's that, therefore these things are fixed. And I mean, maybe you guys can help me because I was trying to do my own research. Can you differentiate for me autism from gender dysphoria?
Oh, they're completely different.
Yeah.
So autism.
No, but do you understand what I mean though? Is that if communication of social norms is one of the issues that people with autism struggle with, and gender has any element of a social construct to it, wouldn't all people who are autistic or on the spectrum have issues with gender?
Okay, so you realize, okay, you are gender non-conforming.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Like
I'm clearly queer coded, Jacob. I understand that.
And every like, and that was part of those graphs I showed at the very beginning from the CAS report, where like there was an overlap, right?
Yeah.
Just so there are stereotypically male behaviors, there are stereotypically female behaviors, and almost zero men do all of the stereotypical male behaviors and none of the stereotypical female behaviors. That's just not a thing.
Right.
Identity is how you view yourself, right? And
that's how they define it.
Well, yeah, but
I think it's actually more complicated, but
it is more okay. Identity, I mean, as Jordan Peterson likes to say, is negotiated between you and other people.
Yeah.
Right. And it is. So one of the most surprising things I ever learned was that octopi don't have a sense of self, which was like, are you serious? Because they're one of the most intelligent creatures. And I just assumed they had a sense of self. But because they're solitary creatures have no identity, right? So yes, identity is something that reflects how you interact with other people, right? Somebody who is on autism spectrum, and I'm no expert on autism, right? But autism is thought patterns and how they view things and their relationship, and I actually think it has a lot closer relationship to schizophrenia in certain ways, but somebody who and I know, so not through mental health but through my business in insurance, I have a lot of clients who needed help with their insurance because they're trans. Right. And I know a lot of trans people, dozens of trans people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure I've known any of them because I don't really know trans children who have been on the spectrum.
Well, so that's the other thing, is that the rise that is currently occurring is like among youth. And I have seen that. So from working with homeless adults, my wife was working at a youth drop-in that was a preventative, like to prevent people from becoming homeless, kind of. I don't want to completely get into it, but as a result of it, I knew a ton of people who were trans, who were younger, and the younger people who were trans, without a doubt, fell into all the stereotypes that people would consider. They were on the spectrum. They had other, quote, comorbidities. They were sexually assaulted. All of those things were all things that like you could witness in real time. And part of why I was wondering as well is I was watching a video specifically on this where a psychologist was just recommending, not in any despairing way, saying, do you have a client who is on the autism spectrum? You should check if they have gender dysphoria. Do you have any clients who have gender dysphoria? You should check if they're on the spectrum. Like, and not even against either of those diagnoses.
I'll let Gage talk, but Max is an actual associate clinical social worker and
wonderful
health professional. So, welcome.
What did I miss?
Everything.
So the story that's coming to mind is my first MSW placement. I was at an acute inpatient ward for adolescents, and some plurality of the patients were in that trans, non-binary category. There was one patient in particular who saw me in the milieu and asked me my pronouns, to which I said he, him, to which they're like, what? They let a sissy on my psych ward using cis as an epithet against me? To which I played along. It's like, yeah, that's against the rules. And they laughed and we got along fine.
Mm-hmm.
I had a similar experience. Like it was a big deal being called when I lead the trans youth group. I'm always made fun of as the sissy in the group and everything. And but there's also a playfulness to it that's complicated, and I really like working with youth in that capacity because youth have an ability to play with these things in a way that adults don't. And I think part of that is because, well, this goes to your point you were making, David, about and just kind of like, okay, talking about this overlap between autism and gender dysphoria and everything is very complicated because gender dysphoria is not just a thing that happens in a bubble in terms of someone's own individual life.
Right.
It is a worldview, and it is also a deeply important community for youth. This is really important. A lot of groups, the only places people can feel like they're safe and make friends are within the LGBT group or the Gay Straight Alliance or any of these various groups that exist at schools or at campuses or all these different types of things. And it ends up resembling something more akin to an alternative group than it does actually about any individual constituency of gender dysphoria in the individual members.
Yes.
And so if you have someone who in some sense is who has ASD and for various reasons they're having trouble fitting in other social groups, this is an appropriate place for them to come and feel like they have a home and a space. And then now they're adapting that worldview the way anyone adapts a worldview when they enter into a group, especially your youth. You and like, okay, what do we believe so that I fit in? So the fitting in is primary to the actual ideology. That's classic children behavior. And so that's happening in these types of communities in a really important way, making it a lot more complicated to understand the relationship between autism spectrum disorder and gender dysphoria from some sort of a clinical objective standpoint.
Well, and these ideas that I think are related to culture. My real first entrance into any of this overlap was I was really into punk rock when I was in high school, and this was late 90s, and everyone who was gay was a punk. there just was no queer community that wasn't punk rock in Windsor, Ontario, right? Where you had all these fringe people. And so part of me trying to figure out a lot of this stuff, number one, I was emo, and emo, exactly what Jacob said when I first came on. There was a bunch of stereotypes of masculinity, which I didn't feel I fit, right? I didn't play any sports. I loved drama. I wrote poetry. I felt very culturally gay, right? And
Does your
then
wife know you're gay?
yeah, she does. And my one of my ex-girlfriends, well, I guess most of the girls I dated in high school all fell into the category that Abigail Schreier says is the groups that are most transitioning. Basically, if you dated me in high school, you probably were self-harming or had an eating disorder or something like that. And one of my most serious relationships, again, all punk rock people, later on, now I've wondered if I'm still allowed to say that they're my ex-girlfriend, because they go by different pronouns now. So I'm like, do I get extra cred for that, or how does that work?
Reminds me of that song, All My Exes Live in Texas.
Yeah. Well, and I'm also my ex-girlfriend is in Canada dating right, because there's an Avenue Q song about being gay. Yeah.
And there's an Avenue Q song about my girlfriend who lives in Canada.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. That's exactly right. Yeah. So seeing that transition where all these people all found their identity there, but also like felt comfortable being masculine or feminine at that time within the constraints that punk rock had, and that some of those, like, I've wondered about this because of Manic Panic, which is the color that trans people all and lesbians all dye their hair. Those were all the colors of that people dyed their hair when they had the like the emo haircut where boys and girls looked exactly the same. They're like, was the thing is like, are those lesbians or is it just an emo couple? When I was younger, because like all with that, I had that haircut swooped across my face. But everyone within that community is now, like, what used to be the punk rock community is now the trans community. Does that just sound crazy, or
No. That makes, I mean, that's a good connection to what I was saying about the way in which the cultural element of this
right
is really, really important, and how in some sense ideology is a bonding mechanism in a really, really important way, especially for children. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the videos of at various college campuses, or even sometimes in high schools and stuff like that, of just a ton of children like locking, or college students locking arms, and they're protesting something, and they'll protest. Oftentimes it's like about Free Palestine or something like that, and they're locking arms and they won't let something through, and it's like this, you can feel this group culture, and a lot of the folks are part of the LGBTQ community, and they're in some sense acting out their community the way communities try to act out and find a body in the world. And you see all of these things happening, and everyone's treating this phenomena like it's something so unbelievably different than things we've seen in the past. And I think, to your point, David, about like, if we just think about it in terms of like punk rock and the way that manifested, it's like, yes, the ramifications are very different for something like this because there's an intensity about it that the Cash report really points out. But I don't want to lose sight of that, and lose sight of the cultural aspect, and how I think in some sense, a huge part of addressing it is meeting youth at that level in terms of their needs of belonging and community formation.
So
Yeah.
I mean, so part of what the Cass review, like the fact, this is one of the things which is like, why is this review having to actually say this? Like, it is talking about complex interplay between biological, psychological, and social factors. And I'm sure Gage and Max remember constantly, like, the word biopsychosocial has become like the key word I have to put in every third sentence in every paper I write in school.
Jacob, they don't read your papers anyway, remember?
But and like this is a very good illustration of, yeah, there are all these factors, and in different people, different amounts of each factor is going to be determinative in who they are and how they behave, right? And like, for example, puberty. So this idea that there are certainly girls who have been sexually assaulted who are about to enter puberty are incredible by that idea and want to go on puberty blockers. Like, you cannot be an intelligent human being and tell me that there is not a single girl who has been raped as a prepubescent girl and is not scared of going into puberty and menstruating. Like, you just cannot tell me that does not exist. The question becomes, like, okay, does that apply to every little boy who comes and wants puberty blockers? Probably not. He's a boy, right? So, like, can we does it, do we even need to have the discussion that no, there is no simple answer to how do you treat someone who presents as a distressed, not just child, adult, someone who presents as being distressed about their gender identity, right?
Well, and that was part of what I was saying before too, is that I think one of the issues is people don't know how to still take the thing seriously if they don't buy into what the person is saying. Because there's a possibility, like we, again, at the youth drop-in center, there was someone very, like, long history of abuse from multiple family members, and that should be taken seriously, right? And you shouldn't just dismiss the fact that they're interested in transitioning, because that might be one of the only ways that they can receive mental health like care, is that no one takes it seriously unless it's related to particular issues. And that was something that we saw directly multiple times.
There's something that isn't quite tracking with me. So let me just put it out there.
Okay.
I've had several trans patients, but none of them endorsed distress over their identity. And I think it had to do with where I encountered them in the mental health funnel. Like, I don't expect to, I mean, it depends on your workplace, but I don't expect to see any patients at that first step where they're first experiencing gender dysphoria, because at that point they're going to seek out an affirming therapist, and I'm not going to be the one they select unless I'm at a gender clinic, but I don't expect I'd ever take a job there.
Interesting. Yeah. So at the youth drop-in, they had a LGBTQ just like group. Like, if you was at one point, we're hosting things specifically for people who identify as this. And it was very interesting because there were people further along in the transition who didn't show up to the group, because they would say something like, and they seemed more mentally stable. They would be like, no, I don't identify, like, I'm not a trans dude, I'm just a dude. And they identified all the queer kids as like, no, I'm not like them. And there was greater amounts of distress with the people who actually identified with the label of LGBTQ, like labeled themselves as trans, versus the trans dudes that just said, no, I am a man.
Okay, so this is something that I'm seeing a lot in the LGBT community as opposed to the queer community. Like there's a fractionating
Yeah.
of there are and now there's like LGB no T groups and so from what I have been able to tell, some 40 to 50% of young, right? So I would say under 30 white gay males voted for Trump.
Yeah.
And part of that is because there actually is a real diversity. And when you actually know gay people and trans people and lesbians, like there is a real diversity and these are real human beings. Whereas for a lot of people, they have this hypothetical trans person in mind.
Yeah.
Right.
And that hypothetical trans person has purple hair and is a communist, whereas I'm trying to think of the trans people I know. Yeah, one of them was a communist.
Right.
This is a great point, Jacob. And honestly, it's like it's even important understanding generationally the difference. Like I have a client that's in their 60s and they transitioned 30 years ago. And it's just any of the things people think who are kind of outside of the space just do not apply to this woman at all. And also having transitioned 30 years ago, her own view of her transition is very, very different than someone who is in the process of transitioning, like is the case, or have just recently, like is the case with maybe 90% of transgender people right now. And so there's that can be the case.
This whole non-binary thing is very foreign to a lot of the older trans.
Well, right.
Yeah.
Right. And
and what you were saying before, Gage, about gender play, right? Where we saw a lot of people where they would identify as multiple different things, and there was like I really don't want to make jokes about this, but there were people that also identified as furries, right? So they were doing all kinds of identity, like you could see it as play. One week they were wearing a foxtail. One person had multiple names all within a month, right? Like, I want to be this. No, I want to be this. No, I want to be this. In different days, we'd see different levels of health in a person, and they would express different genders based on how happy or healthy they seemed. So someone shows up in a dress, next time they're wearing like a really, really baggy everything kind of a thing, going by different names, right? Where there's experimentation as to what fits.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I also feel that there's an important piece working with as many transgender individuals as I do. My biggest thing is trying to move the conversation in a direction that is not delegitimizing the serious life situations and traumas that I hear about from my clients that are put on the back burner because they're transgender. I mean, this client that I mentioned is like, they've been attending therapy for decades, but weren't even addressing very obvious things that are worth addressing in order for this person to live a more meaningful and joyful life. And that really frustrates me, because now this person is, older, and they've been in the mental health world, and their opportunity to be improved by that was robbed from them because of the way in which these topics get taken up.
Yeah.
And it really prevents clinicians from seeing their clients, or just people in general, from seeing them as people.
Yeah.
Well,
And
okay. So one thing that's going on here, Gage, and it's 100% a huge problem that I don't think it can be easily answered, is there are various levels of competency in mental health.
Yeah.
And if the less competent you are in diagnosing and intervening in a person's mental health, then the more you rely on easy, um, formulaic, you want. So I'm working with domestic violence shelters, and we have various levels of staff, right? And everybody has to interact with these people who have serious problems.
Yeah.
And so I was counseling one client, right? And what is shocking to me is how much in a domestic violence shelter you have to tell people to be assertive while teaching them not to be aggressive, because they will be passive until they black out and try to kill you. Because they being passive until they emotionally can't take it anymore and then become physically violent, right? And like, I can't tell someone with a high school diploma who is there, in the evenings and has to deal with this person, how to encourage them to be assertive without being aggressive, without being passive, because that's a very complex behavioral modification that you're trying to teach someone, right? And so there's a culture in the shelter of, we tell everyone, no, you should never be aggressive. You should always turn the other cheek. And turn the other cheek is a great piece of advice for women who are not in a domestic violence shelter usually.
right, it's taking an overarching heuristic and just saying that's the answer.
And the less high quality the mental health. So this person who was, I mean, I don't know what quality the clinicians they had. I was talking to one of the other interns where I'm interning, and we were talking about like all the hours and all the education you need in order to become a licensed therapist. And I said, why are we doing all of this? Why don't we have a 1-week exam where we rate how good of a therapist you are? You take like 2 days of multiple choice exams, like a bar exam, and then you have 3 days of role playing various situations. And I don't care if you have a PhD, and I don't care if you have a high school, if you never graduated high school.
Right.
Like, certify whether or not you will be a good therapist.
Well, and it's interesting because even just being a volunteer working with the homeless or working with youth, we did like de-escalation training and everything. And I knew people who were working in social work, and they're like, I really wish I had learned this in school, right? Like, what do you do when a mentally ill person wants to assault someone else and it's lunchtime? Like, what do you do in that situation? How do you do that in a nonviolent way?
On Monday, I asked my professor. So I'm finishing up my first year and going into my second year. On Monday, I asked my professor, so will our future classes have more methodology and like actual? And her answer was, well, that's not really the classes that are supposed to teach you that.
Yeah. Do you think that like any form of counseling should at least have like a week of jujitsu? Like, what do you think?
Actually, that's funny because I just tweeted at Rafe Kelly because somebody said that he thanked Rafe Kelly for teaching him to roughhouse with his kid. And so what I've started doing, I run parenting groups, and I've been telling the moms, dance with your kids. And Rafe Kelly said he loved that, but he said his wife dance fights with his kids, and I'm like, no, you don't understand. I work in domestic violence shelters. We don't anything fight, right? We don't play fight. We don't dance fight. We don't, right? So like, I just tell them to dance, but I also suggested to the development person, the person who like does community relations, that we bring someone in to teach the kids martial arts, and she made it happen like that. Like, I just asked her, hey, is it possible we could get martial arts classes for the kids?
Yeah.
And she's like, well, I don't think there is anything. And then half an hour later, she's like, I called a friend. We're going to start having martial arts classes in the shelter. It's like, I love you.
Well, and I think maybe slightly related to what we're kind of talking about is one of the people that was on the spectrum, trans. We think there may have been some kind of family abuse. Obviously, did not have good experience with rough and tumble play because we were doing a dinner program at the youth drop-in, and they bit someone hard enough to make them bleed. And my wife and I were talking about that, like how hard you have to bite in order to break skin. Like what lack of level of rough and tumble play someone must have had to think that this was all in good fun. Yeah. I wish we all still learned how to dance also, because guys don't know how to do it. The girls all had sleepovers where they learned, and I didn't. I had to learn on the streets,
in the mosh pits.
Yeah. Yeah.
Many kids are just being raised on iPads, and that's really not an exaggeration to the amount of time that kids are just on tablets. Like it's actually just like commonplace, like understanding now that like, oh, you have a kid between this wide range of ages, probably like between like, I don't know, 2, 3, all the way up to like, 12, 13, 14.
Yeah.
It's like you get them an iPad. That's a huge part of parenting, and that's the thing that they do. You put it to them while they eat. It helps them fall asleep. So they have the iPad there. It's playing something, and they fall asleep with it. And I've seen this firsthand in many different families. It is unbelievable. You can't even separate. I tutor kids, and I can't. The iPad is just part of them, and it's a major source of just constant dopamine that's just flooding their brain and confusing them about their relationship with the real world.
The report actually talks about that a bit.
Oh, I didn't see that part. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, one of the reasons. I mean, I wish the United States had a capacity to have a report like this. You would think that the Surgeon General of the United States would be able to put out a similar report, but the Surgeon General is appointed by the president. And so, and we no longer trust the Surgeon General to be, I mean, right now our Surgeon General is trans. And I wonder if the current Surgeon General is looking at the cast review and what she is thinking.
Dr. Vivek Murthy is trans?
No, is it Murthy was Trump's Surgeon General.
Really? I thought
Yeah,
Murthy-
now is Levine. Is Rachel Levine is the Surgeon General of Trump?
Woman of the year, man of the year. That's right.
Oh no, Murthy. So what happened to Rachel Levine?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Murthy, because I remember reading, Murthy did a report. Murthy did a I thought was pretty good report last year on.
Levine is, but why is she wearing a admiral's? I don't.
They are always wearing that outfit. That's how I think of them. I'm not joking. That's what I think of them wearing.
Right. Murthy did a report last year on what he called an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, which is actually a very interesting report. Similar in many ways in terms of formatting and everything to the CAST report. That's what it made me think of. Now, the loneliness and isolation epidemic is, as far as it's rather apolitical as far as these things can be. And so I read that report and I didn't get any political bias from it at all.
Okay.
But
Jake. Oh no, I had something to say to Jacob, and now he's gone. So never mind.
what else you got, Max?
Oh, when he was talking about bringing in dance and martial arts, well, first I thought you could just bring it together with Krav Maga for kids.
Yeah. They're breakdance fighting. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
But talking
Some
about
kids
that
playing
reminded me of my job now, where I'm working with schizophrenics.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ideas that I read about for working with those patients is that they're so caught up in their heads about whatever hallucinations and delusions they're having, that the intervention is making them do real physical things. Like I'm advocating to bring in a gardening group.
Yeah. It's
Right.
have you heard the G.K. Chesterton quote about schizophrenia?
No.
Is you think that they've lost their reason, but that's all they have is their reason. And I don't know how someone with actual understanding might feel, but the idea being that that there's a real issue of people not being enough in their bodies. Like, how do you, out of your head, out of this place of what you can justify or find logical or whatever, just be actually more physical.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. I like some of that. But just with this perspective I'm developing in the mental health field, I suspect that schizophrenia is metabolic fundamentally, where the hallucinations are something like, I don't want to say a sleep disorder, but a dream disorder.
Okay.
Where it's like during their waking consciousness, there are dream elements super like imposing themselves in their waking reality such that they're responding appropriately.
Right.
Interesting.
So
I'd be really interested to know, like, is this kind of more like cutting edge understanding that you've been looking into?
Yeah, I might characterize it that way.
But no, I'm interested in reading more on that perspective. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I can send you some stuff, but like,
well, and
I don't know how much longer I'm going to stay at this job, and I'm thinking the highest leverage thing I could do is probably advocate for like better nutrition for the patients.
Yeah.
Sandy asks, Max, how do you know when and where, I guess, not martial arts? Gardening, yes, better.
Oh, Jacob, I was suggesting a gardening group for my schizophrenic patients, so that's why that came up. When or when not martial arts? I don't know. I haven't brought in that intervention yet. Although, just in my own journey, I joined wrestling in middle school and high school, and I think that was really good for me.
Yeah.
Even though I hated competing, like that was so stressful. Like I don't think high school sports should be so competition driven, which is sort of a side topic. But
Well,
I think
when I do want kids to learn how to dance. Like I think martial arts pairings where kids actually learn how to fight their own gender and then dance with the opposite, I think would be really good. Because they'd be understandings of your body and limitations in completely different ways. What's appropriate, what's inappropriate.
I like that. Thanks in part to Jacob, I've been connecting more with the Orthodox Jewish community in recent years. And one thing that I've come to appreciate about it is how homosocial it is.
Oh, yeah.
For some of those reasons.
Look, sometimes a really good party needs a sheet that separates the men from the women so you can just have the best time.
But there's a hole in the sheet.
No, that's an urban legend. And I hung out with the Amish. There no holes in sheets either.
Well, I mean, I'm saying that a little bit flippantly, but there are porous boundaries. Like in the prayer service, there's the mechitza, there's the boundary between the men and the women's side, but it's not a steel wall. Like people are peeking over behind or coming up to their husbands, and
You're in Los Angeles, Max. When I remember in Jerusalem, we went and had the dinner at this family's house, and it was me, another young student, so 2 young men, and an old couple. And so it's just the 4 of us. And the wife was at a separate table eating. Yeah, and people in the Hasidic community, men and women do not eat at the same table, even though we were in the same room and talking and stuff. But there was a separate table.
Wow.
makes sense.
And you know what? I am absolutely unapologetically sexist, and I think the Orthodox community being like very, very sexist is pretty much, that does not actually mean sex chauvinist and misogynist or misandrist, but it means recognizing boys are boys and girls are girls, and boys and girls are very different, right? A boy has a bar mitzvah at 13 and a girl has a bat mitzvah at 12 because boys mature more slowly than girls do. Get over yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of secular people project their sense of sexism onto those divides.
Well, I mean, the people will say to me, separate is not equal because Brown versus Board of Education like rules everything, and sex is as meaningless as racial distinctions in education.
I think Sandy is mentioning this in the chat where I think all of these ideas, which are fun ideas that I think we are discussing, I think that she's making a good point that how do you apply these things? Because there are definitely situations where if everyone is just taught how to fight, that could result in a more violent society. Or does it just need to be that Sandy also needs to learn jujitsu, not just her kids? Like, I don't know.
Chad, I sent you a link if you want to jump on. Chad actually is one of the inspirations for me going into the mental health field, because of the work he does with the alcoholic community.
Hmm.
Yeah. And one thing that I've actually found, the reason I'm continuing my substance abuse program, even though from everything I've heard, like there's no reason to continue it because like once you're licensed with an LCSW, like you no longer, you don't even bother with the certification. Like nobody seems to. But what I have found is that the it's funny, we call it behavioral health as if it's not mental health, as if like substance abuse is something completely different. And we talk about dual diagnosis because if you have a diagnosis, oh, and another thing. So I'm doing an internship with substance abuse. I'm doing an internship with my social work, right? And so if you are seeing someone for a mental health diagnosis, right, and they're seeing another therapist, you're supposed to collaborate with the therapist, and that's ethically required. But if they're seeing a substance abuse counselor, a behavioral health person, that's completely different, and there's no coordination required because that's a different diagnosis, and this person is dual diagnosis, and they're receiving separate therapy. And we treat it like there's mental health, behavioral health, and physical health, and these don't need to coordinate as much as, like, if somebody has schizophrenia and depression, right, or I don't know, anxiety and depression, which half the people who have anxiety also have depression, right? They're like, if you're treating them for anxiety or for depression, and somebody else is treating them for anxiety or depression, you have to coordinate. But if you're treating them for alcohol abuse and they also have depression, right? Like somehow that's completely different, which is like, what are you talking about? Although the methodologies tend to be, it's funny, the methodologies tend to be different, but they're not. It's weird. Max nodded a lot, but he's not saying anything.
Yeah,
Jacob,
I've run into the exact same thing in my workplace
Yeah.
of say supervisors making a distinction between, oh, how would you treat dual diagnosis, as if it's something different than everything else we're doing.
Yeah, we call it dual diagnosis. So if you have a mental health, like if it's in the first part of the DSM, there's various parts, right? Then it's one diagnosis, and if it's in the other one, it's in another part.
Yeah, and this is where I started to get into it with you one time, where I said basically my way of unpacking that is that any addiction is effectively self-medicating for some other thing that's going on. Like I see it more as a symptom than as its own distinct.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I really don't.
Have you come across the literature where some people think nicotine might be related to depression? That nicotine might be a good medication for depression, and that a lot of people who are smokers might be self-medicating, like that it's
nicotine has a nootropic effect.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the thing. Substance abuse, like I used to not be convinced of sex addiction and food addiction. Addictive, like it's separate, like the way classical physical conditioning affects your behavior is very different, I believe, certainly ideologically, like how it's causative of other mental health disorders, maybe not depression, but also depression. But certainly I think like schizophrenia, I don't see. You can definitely be an addict without having any other actual psychological disorder, I believe.
Got it. Well, I don't put too much stock in psychiatric disorders.
I put tons of stock in. This is my Bible. You didn't know?
Yeah, but it's like I'm into EEG.
Yeah.
So it's a different place we're coming from.
Yeah. I mean, look, and the fact is, psychology is a very new science, and the fact that it has been so obviously politically co-opted, not just recently. I mean, even from the very beginning, right? Um, it may actually be less political now than it was 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
It may, in fact, be less political now than it used to be. But at the same time, yeah. It's depressing how not good the conversation seems to be. And I mean,
This conversation, or
no. The general conversation, like psychology as a discipline.
Mhm.
I am very, very disappointed in the classes that I've been taking, and certain people have said to me, "Well, you decided to go to Walden University, which obviously isn't the greatest university in the world." But I don't know that better, higher ranked universities are less infected with obvious stupidity than Walden is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a reminder that the scientific enterprise is not some sort of a removed objective thing. And I mean, it's just not. And it's always downstream from value and the direction in which culture is heading. I mean, even at the advent of the scientific method and everything, that remains to be the same case. And so, I mean, part of at least what like I see with Fountain of Comfort is in some sense is looking to not in some sense discard that process, but in some sense try to bridge this value system that in some sense is more in the religious sphere without in some sense compromising the science, and to try and understand their relationship and how mental health in some sense really exists at the center of that in a really important way, in a way that may be like really, really special when we're talking about the other relationships between like science and value, largely because it concerns the soul of an individual in a very direct manner.
Okay, so I don't want to fall into the Cartesian problem of like imagining that a person's body and soul are not intimately related, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, and like, yes, our body is part of makes a difference in who we are, and part of the Gnostic nature of gender ideology is this idea that, oh, I have a gender identity that is divorced from the hormones in my body completely.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you really think that the hormones in your body do not at all affect your femininity or masculinity? Like, are you insane? Right? So like, let's materialism, just material reductionism, and this is what Vervaeke's constantly talking about, right? Material reductionism is and the fact I didn't have to take a single anatomy course yet. I had to take it in my substance abuse course. I had to take a physiology of addiction course. Like my social work, my master's in social work has had zero requirement of an anatomy course. How do you become a psychologist without taking an anatomy course?
Well, and I don't know if this is an okay opinion, but I don't. The fact that we don't have good information on nutrition still, that there's not a ton of great science, like the fact that, for instance, someone could be a carnivore or could be a vegetarian as a child. That's like when I was growing up, that was impossible. You need dairy, you need gluten, you need, right? These are things people need to survive, right? Um, but what effect diet has on mental health. Um, I like I don't think I've ever talked to you about this before, Jacob, but I at one period was diagnosed as being bipolar, and I was medicated for a period of time, but it was during one of the most difficult periods of my life, and I was working multiple jobs and I was like not sleeping. I stopped exercising. I gained like 30 pounds in like 4 months, something like that. And then I worked on all of those things and became very religious about my sleep schedule, because I also found out that sleep schedule has a huge amount to do. Like my wife and I, we have a week before daylight savings time, a reminder on our calendar that, just a reminder, change in sleep cycle means a change in mood, right? And like treating it as an important thing. And that if I'm proactive on those things, I got to a point where my doctor was like, you don't need to be medicated anymore.
Okay, so you hit on one of my great pet peeves, which is daylight savings time.
Yeah. Yes. It's terrible. It's leading to psychological breaks, obviously.
It murders people.
Yeah.
The science on this is clear.
No,
the
no,
number
yeah.
of people who die because of daylight savings time
Yeah.
is clearly above zero.
Yeah.
Right? And none of the people who were like, if it saves one life, let's shut down all the schools, are like, let's get rid of daylight savings time. And it was on the ballot in California and it didn't pass.
Yeah. Yeah, preposterous. I'm sorry, but like that's just an example though of something that it sounds so hokey to some people, but I'm just like, we have to act like you can actually make a change. I don't like, there's a possibility that there's so much chemicals in the brain doing stuff, but like at one point I was on multiple medications because one of my medications gave me a hand tremor, and so I had a medication for one of my medications along with another medication.
Yeah, no, that happens a lot. So I actually, my cousin is a psychiatrist, and his practice as a psychiatrist, so he doesn't take any insurance, and he just charges you straight out. He's like, absolutely forget insurance, right? And their big thing is nutrition, and lots of things that have like a lot of people. And he also experiments with psychedelics, and like, so it's a very different practice that basically you could only do in California. But yeah, actually, Max talked to him a bit about his practice.
That's right. And David, I appreciate that story about your own life, because Jacob, you're right. There are more hospital admissions right after daylight savings time for exactly that reason. and this is where I run into issues with DSM characterizations of things, because bipolar disorder is characterized as a mood disorder. It's not. It's a circadian rhythm disorder with mood symptoms.
Always?
I mean, like I said, I'm into neurophysiology, so
Yeah.
but like typical bipolar 1-2.
I mean, sleep, yes, circadian rhythms. So, one of the biggest changes that allowed me to go back to being a human being was no longer fighting with my sleep cycle. And it was huge for me, right? Just being willing to go to bed at at midnight and wake up at 8 a.m. Like, I pretty much refuse to wake up. Like, almost never will I make an appointment before 8 a.m., right? Or even right at 8 a.m. And that made a huge difference in my life and my capacity to function, which is one of the reasons. And California actually did this. Now, by law, high schools in California cannot start before 8 a.m. It's
Good.
against the law.
Good.
I like that.
And I'm sure there's plenty of people who, especially kind of like the right wing people, who are like, oh, just make them wake up at 6 and early to at bed and early to rise. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. At the same time, like, there's so many different, like, people are so different from each other that, yeah, I mean, the DSM. At the same time, I find it absolutely ridiculous that anybody would think every single person who has one of these diagnoses, any one of these diagnoses, has it for the same reason, much less there are people who will tell me everyone who has a diagnosis out of here, it's because they don't eat enough beef, right? There are people who say that if you were to just make everyone eat only beef, we could just get rid of all psychoactive medications. It's like, how simplistic is your view of the world?
Right.
Make things. It's a constant insistence to take away complexity from the world.
Well, and I feel like, Max, maybe I'm incorrect, that kind of complexity is part of why you were speaking of diagnoses the way that you were. Like, am I someone with bipolar? Like, I don't know how to actually answer that question. Like, I have, as you actually said, I sometimes have what appears to be some kind of a sleeping disorder occasionally, but the mood fluctuations and the issues, where any kind of issues with it within my life are so gone, right? That it's like I wouldn't be diagnosed for those things, but every now and then it's just a couple of days where I don't need to sleep, which is an interesting thing, and I'm just hyper productive for like a period of time, right? And then there's conversations with my wife where I can feel it, or she tells me things and I just trust her. Okay, I have to calm down because I'm too excited right now, right? Like, but I wouldn't think I should be medicated or think medication would even help with that kind of stuff. It's like fine.
So this is one of the more controversial things I will say. There are people for whom doing cosmetic surgery will help them more than giving them therapy.
Like, what do you mean in terms of cosmetic surgery, in terms of like around gender dysphoria, or are you just talking more generally?
Well, I mean, it also ends up in,
People are depressed because they're ugly. That's what he's saying.
there are people who are depressed because they are ugly.
Yeah.
And once you accept that, then gender affirming surgery becomes a lot less crazy than it seems to some people.
Yeah.
Right, but it does beg the question, even if that be the case, that okay, is that the appropriate solution?
Right.
Is that the appropriate treatment? We can't just have a mental health model where we look to alleviate symptoms just as the only thing that we're looking at.
Correct, but at the same time, sometimes like you do the best you can to make the situation not as bad as it was. Right?
Yeah, but it has to be pretty extreme. Like you got to be in Cuba in order to fix your carburetor with chicken wire. You know what I mean? Like it's if all other parts are not working, is only when you're going to start doing that.
Right, and I mean I basically agree, but there were definitely like girls in my high school who got a nose job, and that did them more good than a lot of years of therapy would have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, and I'm not even necessarily disagreeing. I don't. what it brings up though is it brings up a question around like what are we looking to, and I'm not saying it's one or the other, because I don't think it is, but are we looking to, in some sense, make people feel better? Or are we looking at, we could say that's what something's the case on one extreme. And then on the other extreme is like, regardless of how they feel, we're helping for them to participate in their teleological end or something like that. Like, you know what I mean?
Right. No, absolutely.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
I was going to say telos is
Yeah.
what defines that, and that's
Right.
why we have the confusion.
Right. So that's, I'm not, I guess what I'm saying is just like, okay, you have an ugly nose. Like,
Yeah.
right. Like this.
Thanks a lot, Gage. So anti-Semitic.
Oh my gosh.
Hey, that's because you're Middle Eastern, not because you're Jewish, okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's
I'm
fine.
just joking with you. Go ahead.
What did I walk into? No.
I know a lot of Middle Eastern people who have gotten nose jobs. A lot. It's,
But like,
not
okay,
a small number.
someone doesn't like their nose, and
Yeah.
in some sense, one of the problems of technology is that it can trick you into solving problems that aren't actually solutions, but really just circumvent the problem. Now, this isn't always the case with technology. That's not what I'm saying, but
Yeah. Well,
And sometimes circumventing a problem is good enough.
well, and that's why this is so complicated. But is it good enough for now, or are you saying it's good enough, period? Because I feel like that's important.
yeah. So Gage, I think I'm really tracking with what you're saying, and maybe this will go too far, which is I do feel that this is related to the autism thing that I was bringing up earlier, because I have a friend. He is on the autistic spectrum, but he's also obsessed not just with trains, as the stereotype goes, but also with. He's the only person I know that knows what all like demi boy like he knows the 100 different genders. He knows what each one means. He identifies in different ways on it. And we were having a conversation about it. And I said that one of the reasons why I don't think we should just jump to surgeries is because I don't think castration cures autism, right? Is that what I mean by that is like you'll have people obsessing over these systems and then I can fix this through that. And there's aspects of it which it will fix, and then there's aspects which it doesn't. So for instance,
Right.
maybe you're right about nose jobs, but we know breast implants are just a terrible idea. Like breast implants, whatever they do for an increase in or a decrease in depression, they do a terrible, terrible disservice to your body and sometimes create depression. I don't know if you
Right,
follow
there's this
me.
law of unintended consequences.
Right.
And it's impossible to know those intended consequences. So
Right.
and because of that, so you may do something to address the problem, but you actually create a much bigger problem. And I guess I also worry about where do you draw the line in terms of what the thing is? It's like you could say, I mean, Abraham slept with Hagar in some sense to solve the problem right away.
Right.
And look at how that
Surrogacy.
I know, so there's this. It brings up that type of a question because there's a very important idea in the Bible of wait. Right? Like there's this
Right.
patience in some sense for something to come about in its proper time.
Right.
Which
And
Christians don't believe in at all.
And we are waiting for a second coming. So you're just incorrect, and that's fine. I'm okay with you being incorrect. I understand. It's fine. But we did witness this as well, is that there was real worry that certain people would take. We were very happy that certain people only socially transitioned and didn't medically. And so we were actually grateful that some people were gender queer and not actually trans, because they didn't go the medical route. And sure enough, as soon as they went through a little more puberty and guys enjoyed their boobs, they were female again. Right. Like, and it was a positive thing that they had female body parts, because they had positive, I mean, it's so weird to talk about positive social interaction where it's like, okay, these aspects of my body that I hated, I now kind of like. So it's a good thing that you didn't take a huge step too early, make a Hagar sort of decision, if you will, to use your metaphor, which I think is a good one.
So back to the cast review. One of the most controversial recommendations they've basically made is it seems like they're going for no transitioning until 25.
Yeah, I saw that 25, which is really interesting given that you would think it would be kind of around a consent thing, but instead they're kind of making more of a body physiology, biological argument from that.
I wonder if people, given the option, would say that 25 is when you are an adult, because there's everyone, it's become common. I don't even know to what level of accuracy that the human brain does not fully mature until you're 25, right? Like, is that actually accurate entirely?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, your body, I mean, it's not like your brain doesn't continue to change, but
Right.
your corpus callosum, the part of your brain which, so this has actually been another personal bugaboo is, I did not know that like your corpus callosum comes in at 25, and I had problems with anxiety before I turned 25,
Mm-hmm.
but right around 26 was when I had severe agoraphobia and could no longer leave my bedroom to go to my bathroom, right? Because guess what? When a whole part of your body, which is meant to like inhibit action and make you like have appropriate amounts of anxiety, comes in, and you already have an anxiety problem, it's gonna make it worse.
Yeah.
Right?
And Matthew's in the chat making mention of something which is, I know, statistically true, is that after 25, people who are criminals are less criminal.
Right.
Like
So there are definitely changes, and this is one of the things that I've started telling parents is, if your kid has an anxiety disorder at age 20, 22, you really need to take care of it now, right? Before, because once they're 25, 26, that anxiety disorder will likely go into overdrive.
Yeah.
But that requires actually knowing about, like, the fact we don't even take like we took human development, like psychological development. Even that wasn't very detailed, but like, yeah, physiological, like hormones, you know, like none of this is any of in the curriculum in my school. I can't imagine the National Association of Social Workers requires it at any school.
Right.
I don't know that the American Psychological Association requires it of people who get a PhD in psychology.
When I would be pastorally giving people advice who were getting married, one of the things that I told every single guy I ever talked to was, there are apps that are just period trackers of your wife. Get one immediately. And like, people coming back to me being like, that was actually like really good advice. It's just like, yeah, knowing your wife's hormones is super helpful for you.
Yeah, and guess what? Actually, marriage classes for Orthodox Jews always include talking about your wife's cycle.
Right.
Huh.
Right. Yeah. Seems like something you might want to know.
But they don't need the app.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. There's no app. Yes. Although, actually, I'm guessing the women do have apps. Yeah. Tracking.
The women do, but the men don't need the app.
Yeah, the men do.
That's right. That the app's not really for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well. Yeah. The more
I actually need to go. So, speaking of sleep schedules and all that, don't want to wake up with some mental health issues and all that.
That's a good point. You know what? You know what, Jacob? I was only here for Gage, so I'm leaving.
Also, Gage, don't forget, you got to work on that kid. So.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Get the app. Get the app.
The app. Yeah, right.
It does. There's a little thing. It tells you when she's ovulating.
Right. Helps you with both sides. Right.
Yeah. It's great news.
Perfect. Go get the app.
Avoid, engage.
Oh,
Okay.
Oh, snap.
So Max, what do you want to say about this whole thing? You're the actual clinical social worker. You're not just a counseling student.
About this whole thing, huh?
This whole thing, yeah. Did you actually see the cast review? Have you paid attention at all to it?
I have no idea what that is.
So that's the official topic of this stream. So
Perfect.
In the UK, the National Health Service 4 years ago commissioned the retired president of their College of Pediatrics to look into the whole treatment of trans kids. And the way she put it was she thought she was going to come out of retirement, spent 6 months rubber stamping whatever was already going on, and go back into retirement. And so this was 4 years ago. 2 years ago, they came out with an interim report. Last Wednesday, they came out with a full report, link in the description. It's 388-page PDF, which I've been showing parts of. I haven't gotten a chance to read the entire thing. I would actually say for somebody who is not involved in mental health, it might actually be easier to read through the entire thing than it is for me, because a lot of it is like, okay, I already know this. Why am I reading? And I skip. And then like the important stuff is just like one line on one page, because the rest of the fluff is just there to like tell you, well, also to politically protect her. But so what has happened in the UK, and Mary Harrington, I didn't include her I didn't include her article in here. I will put a link in the chat to her article. Over the past week, this report has been a bombshell in the UK. The Labour Party has completely changed its tune. Almost all of the basically everybody has changed their tune, because they are genuinely like, some people tried calling her a transphobe, but like that dog will not hunt. And so the response has generally been, I've been calling it adults in the room. Like, it has been the type of response you would like, which is a lot of people being like, oh, here is an actual pediatrician telling us things that a responsible adult should think is non-controversial. Let's do that which is non-controversial and act responsibly according to it, which is shocking, right? In Australia, there's been a real reaction by the ideologues trying to dismiss it. That's the only place I've seen a reaction. In the United States, they have been trying to ignore it, but the United States is having a really hard time explaining why Europe is being less trans-affirming than the United States is.
Especially because the people who are very pro one side are also very pro like those European countries, and believe their medical
like,
systems.
We're backwards Americans. We should listen to what especially the countries,
the Scandinavians.
The countries which are like no more puberty blockers, no social transitioning of children, are like Finland and the UK.
Right. Whose medical
like
system?
Hungary and Poland, it would be one thing, but it's Finland and the UK.
Yeah.
But doesn't part of it have to do with payer systems for the healthcare? So, like, part of why it's so big in America is because of the money, right?
So I mean, in the UK, there are private clinics, and certainly a lot of people have been going to private clinics instead of the National Health Service. But that's because the National Health Service has long waiting lists. And in the UK, waiting lists is how you make rich people pay for their own care. But it doesn't really, and even here, it really doesn't mean you get very different care, right? The fact is, you get a little bit of different care, but it's not like a doctor at a free clinic in Los Angeles is going to tell you something different is medicine than most of the other doctors in Los Angeles. Although obviously you can go to certain doctors who have like ideological bents, but most people don't go looking for a doctor with an ideological bent. Most people go to doctors and they listen to the doctors. And most doctors actually don't really have an ideological bent. They are going according to the medicals, what they most doctors trust the medical standards to which they are trained.
I think I may be on a slightly different topic. Like, I'm not sure, but like, isn't the financial incentives in America more towards keeping people enrolled in more treatment, like indefinitely?
Well,
Not really. If you have insurance, the insurance company doesn't want you indefinitely receiving treatment.
right.
I mean that is more of a story that people tell online, especially Marxists, than an actual reality of how the healthcare system functions. Because vast majority of people do not have infinite amounts of money. They
Right.
get their healthcare through their insurance, and the insurance company exists to reduce the amount of money that they
But this definitely does have. So in Toronto, there's a famous case where the leader of our main mental health thing is called CAMH, and CAMH, the guy who was doing all the work with transitioning, he came up with the theory. Well, didn't come up with the theory. He was public and was part of a BBC documentary where he actually said that a good chunk of the youth who identified were either gay in non-accepting circumstances and would identify as gay later in life, or were autistic. He
Zucker, right?
Sorry,
Dr. Zucker?
I can't remember his name, but he was the head of their department, um, and was focused on all that stuff. As best I understand, was not ideologically possessed, and enough complaints occurred because I'm living in Canada that they got rid of him and replaced him with someone who would toe the party line. So there are, aside from medical things, there are enough true believers that even though this should have happened in Canada as one of those first places, like Canada should have been one of the places that was the canary in the coal mine. It just doubled down. So I really, really hope that all the Tavistock stuff and all the stuff coming out of Europe is gonna help. But you can still double down, and you can still, yeah. There's
that's been what I've been paying most attention to as far as the cast report, cast review, it's called, and what's going on in the UK. I was wondering if the ideologues are just going to double down.
well, and Jacob, at the beginning of your stream, you were bringing up Natalie Wynn, ContraPoints.
Yeah.
I have followed ContraPoints for a very long time, and I really, really liked them and believed they were an honest actor. And on certain topics, I think they did a video about genderqueer where this is like, you can actually find their transition essentially documented. I bet their old YouTube videos are actually taken down, where they would say things like, well, I'm a man, so these clothes, this isn't women's clothes because they're my clothes, and identified for a very long time as gender queer before saying, oh no, I'm actually trans. And so there's aspects of this that I would say Natalie Wynn is blind to.
Right.
Willfully blind to.
Yeah, well look, any human being has, yeah, I really do wonder with Natalie, like Natalie Wynn is very, very intelligent, very well read. I actually would want to see. I saw kind of a response to the cast report from Natalie Wynn, but obviously she hadn't read it yet, and hadn't really looked into it yet. I don't know what Natalie Wynn is going to say, and obviously, I mean, once you're so invested in a particular community and in a particular narrative, right, it's very difficult to change your tune. What has happened, though, is, for example, Mermaids and Stonewall, which are two of the more prominent nonprofit organizations in the UK, which basically they're like the Trevor Project of the UK. They have they seem to have really changed their tune. Like Mermaids has basically started saying. So I actually pulled this up, and I didn't know if you guys wanted to watch it or not. But so this is a report that was done on channel.
Can't go to college.
In England. I don't want to get. I don't think I will get a copyright strike on this, but let's see.
While you're figuring that out for a second,
Yeah.
Jacob, I just checked, and sure enough, Natalie Wynn has deleted all videos that are older than 6 years. And I was following them for years before that. And so and one of the things that I witnessed is I had a lot more respect for them until I actually saw them debate people who disagreed with them. And then I was like, oh, these perspectives actually can't stand another person going, yeah, but no. In some of those conversations, I would actually say they were pathetic in debate, like bad, really, really bad. And I used to really, really like their material.
Okay. I mean, so I don't know how much I think I mean, if they do a copyright thing, I guess I'll get my first copyright strike. But here, I'll go ahead and I'll play this report. Not the entire thing, but they interview someone who was a doctor at the Tavistock Clinic, and so this is somebody who has a private gender clinic currently in the UK.
Well, Dr. Aidan Kelly works at the Tavistock Clinic and is now a clinical director at Gender Plus, a private practice. And you are offering hormones despite what the CAS review says, aren't you?
We are offering hormone treatments in line with current NHS policy and in line with what the CAS review is saying. So for those aged 16 and 17 who can access gender affirming, so testosterone or estrogen therapies, we're not doing hormone blockers for under the age of 16.
But you are
So they're not doing hormone blockers.
doing puberty blockers for people.
And these are the people that actually somebody else called out as being the person, as the people who are most not going according to the NHS. So they are doing gender affirming cross-sex hormones at 16 and 17. They're not doing puberty blockers anymore.
For over the age of 16.
No, we're not suppressing puberty to delay puberty. We will, for those who've been appropriately assessed and gone through a multidisciplinary team decision process, and we will commence feminizing or masculinizing hormones if appropriate, which is very much in line with NHS policy.
Right, so is there anything you're offering privately that you can't get on the NHS?
apart from actually being able to access an NHS service. I guess if there were no wait list, no. And we're doing everything currently in line with NHS policy and practice. We are a group of former NHS clinicians. I've worked across the child and the adults and one of the adult services for about 7 years. Myself and my colleagues who have the skills and the expertise to deliver the care, but are perhaps frustrated with the inability to kind of see people in a more timely way, which is what's happened in the NHS. You have to remember when the CAS review was commissioned in September 2020 to try and understand how best it needs to meet the needs of this cohort with a growing wait list of about 2.5 years. We're now at the point of publication, and it's about a 4 to 5 year, I think it was said on your the previous clip, of a 5-year wait to be seen. So the wait lists have just gotten worse. And so everyone who works in health knows it's easier to intervene early. You get much less I guess things get much less ingrained. It's much more fluid and flexibility, openness, and so you can work in a much better way to meet all the gender needs, but all the other holistic needs like mental health, neurodevelopmental needs, if you can do that in a more timely way. And that's what we're doing in Gender Plus. We're not doing anything outside of the NHS policies, or despite what some people might say.
Yeah.
I guess this is quite.
So is there anything you disagree with in the CAS final report?
I don't disagree with the CAS final report. I think on the surface level, there are lots of things that, better healthcare, better evidence, that would all be wonderful. I think more holistic care. I think what really I would draw issue with is how we're going to implement this. I think this has gotten, and Dr. Cass referred to this area of healthcare has become so politicized, and that actually people don't want to work in it. We don't know even these other services, people aren't applying for jobs, they're not able to recruit. The people they have recruited have never worked in gender before. So we're now at a place where we've shut down GIDS, and there was problems in GIDS and things needed to be better. I believe it's more of a systemic issue, but we've shut that service down. We've lost all that knowledge base, all that expertise, and instead what we've got is 2 new services with a fraction of the level of staffing, and of those staffing, the clinical expertise and experience. These people have never worked in gender before, so it's in far worse position than we were 3.5 years ago when the CAS report was commissioned.
And do you accept what Hilary Cass says about treatment being driven by ideology?
I guess I can only speak about my practice, and I guess that we don't believe that ideology is any place in any medical care.
But you work in the Tavistock. Do you accept that it was being driven by ideology there?
Do I accept that? Listen, I don't know. I don't agree that the service was led in an ideological way. I think many psychological and mental health related issues have social factors, and so to say that we're immune from our social environment or our culture and context would be naive. And so there certainly have been influences, but I don't think it was driven and led in that sort of way. No.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, Dr. David Bell served as a staff governor at the Tavistock Trust and wrote an internal report in 2018, raising concerns brought to him by colleagues about the way the Gender Identity Development Service was treating patients. Do you think that ideology was driving treatment?
I don't really think it. I think that's a clear fact. It's also clearly stated in the CAS final report, and it was also mentioned in her interim report. But maybe we need to unpack what that means. What it means is that the ordinary...
So this isn't where I remembered it. I thought they asked him if he had any sort of regret for... And I'm pretty sure on a different one, I saw somebody ask if a doctor had regret for prescribing puberty blockers, and they're like, yeah, well, in retrospect, I do, right? And this is actually what's Unheard was taking people to task with, and Mary Harrington, was people have suddenly switched their idea, and Jordan Peterson was saying that they were... Jordan Peterson was saying that, they're all going to deny that they ever did it, right? So in the UK, the discussion has become not so much, do we continue to do this or not? It's become more, did we ever do this, right? Like, to kind of like, I was talking to somebody about the vaccines recently. You're leaving? Bye. Your mic is muted.
Oh, okay. I have to go. Sorry, something's happening.
Later.
Great stream, Jacob. Nice meeting you, Max. Bye.
I was talking to someone about the vaccines, and I was like, vaccinating babies, that makes no sense. And they're like, well, were they vaccinating babies? I'm like, yes, they were vaccinating. And at least in the UK, it seems the narrative has switched to, there weren't, like, nobody was giving anybody puberty. Like, maybe a few people got puberty blockers. It's not a huge deal, right? As opposed to, I think in the United States, it's still like, you oppose giving children puberty blockers, which are completely safe and effective, and the international standard for how you should treat this.
when I was doing sex offender treatment, I know of at least one of our patients who was, I don't want to say treated, but given lupron.
Chemically castrated, yeah. So the puberty blockers was initially a chemical castration used on sex offenders. Yeah.
And my understanding is that it was used at a dose to reduce his sex drive, which is probably a good idea.
Although, I mean, I do wonder how much sex offending. I mean, I'm sure it contributes, but I don't know if people necessarily are sex. If it's the sex drive that's, I don't think it's the only factor in being a sex offender. I don't know. You've done a lot more than I have.
It was certainly not the only factor in that case.
Okay.
And I like to point out that sex offender is a legal construct.
Correct.
There's lots that counts. Like,
Yeah.
The internet guys were very different than the hands-on guys.
Aha. Yes. Well, yeah. Obviously. Yeah. I didn't realize there were that many internet guys.
Well, that's a whole other political thing. Where seems like the feds go after many cases like that because it's a slam dunk.
And it's easy and not dangerous, and like, yeah, it's easy work. Yeah, that's one thing. Like, I have noticed law enforcement officers can be incredibly lazy.
Yeah, at best.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I think our resources would be much better used with many of those guys going straight to probation.
Right. Yeah.
Or just supervised devices even.
There's the more you work in nonprofit, I think the more you see how broken government and nonprofit can be. Yeah.
Well,
and it's not like for-profit is that much less broken. It's broken in different ways. We live in a fallen world, Max. What can I tell you?
It's still falling, Jacob.
It is. It is. Apparently. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Did you have more to say about this or anything you wanted to talk about?
Maybe I can just end it on this note. The other day I watched a movie called My Dinner with Andre.
Okay.
And it's, I don't know if I recommend it, but the whole movie is just a discussion with two guys at a bar, kind of about existentialism and I guess the jadedness and disconnection in our modern world. Almost in an Ayn Rand sort of way where each guy is representing the opposite view. There was one quote that stood out to me. I hope I provided enough context for this to make sense, but the quote is, I mean, things don't affect people the way they used to. I mean, it may very well be that 10 years from now, people will pay $10,000 in cash to be castrated just in order to be affected by something.
Yeah. Did you know cutting never existed before we started discussing it? Like it wasn't something historically that was a psychological symptom, and it obviously is now. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a physical impact with the cut.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. On that happy note, you guys, there's a link to Fountain of Comfort below. Like, subscribe, and do donate, because my hope is that eventually Fountain of Comfort will do everything perfectly, and we will be the best of all mental health providers in the world. Good night, people.
Good night.